Okay, welcome back, everyone. I hope you've all managed to find some caffeine in the short break as we embark on more content, this time more specifically routed in an exploration of right-wing extremisms in context. It's my pleasure today to introduce you to our first speaker, Dr. Benjamin Lee. So Dr. Benjamin Lee is a senior research associate with the Centre for Research and Evidence on Security Threats with the University of St Andrews. And he'll be talking to us today about the evolution of siege culture in the UK. Before I hand over to him, I will just make a quick mention. If you have any questions for Ben over the course of the presentation, please do put them directly into the Q&A bar and not into the chat bar. All right, thank you. Over to you, Ben.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Good morning, everybody from a very dark and cold United Kingdom. I'm just going to share my presentation here. Can everyone see that? Is that okay?
That's fine. You might want to click present though.
There we go.
Yep.
Okay, so yeah, thank you very much for that introduction. My name is Ben Lee. I am a senior research associate at CREST. Confusingly, I'm actually based at another research centre, CSTPV at St Andrews, but my work is funded by CREST, and by way of full disclosure, CREST is funded in large part by the UK security and intelligence agencies. So it's wonderful to be here. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about kind of a branch of the far right, a cluster of the far right called siege culture, and how it's evolved in the UK specifically as a culture. So I'm going to kind of take a case study approach, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Very much the emphasis here is on the subculture as a whole rather than groups specifically. So I want to try and think about something a little bit wider than sort of the narrow groups that you might have heard about. This is a component in some wider CREST research that we're doing around right-wing subcultures and protective factors, but the emphasis here is kind of something that's a little bit more spun off, and it is definitely still in its formative stages, but we're kind of interested in how the subculture as a whole has evolved over time in the UK. And just to kind of not keep you in suspense, we're going to be talking about 4 sort of distinct phases that siege culture has been through in the UK. For those of you, right, yeah, so I said before this was going to be a case study, and there's a few reasons for that. Case studies, generally, they put an emphasis on description and thematic analysis, on having these kind of thick, rich details to have access to, and that's quite a good fit for the data that we have on this space as a subculture. It's quite messy, it's quite distributed, and it takes a lot of different forms. A lot of it is online data collected from forums or websites. We have several key ideological texts. We have a whole host of kind of what you might think of as ephemera. So that might be GIFs or movies or videos or images. And then we have plenty of secondary sources as well around journalistic reporting or campaigning reporting. In terms of kind of case study methodology, this constitutes what you might call a case of most interest, which I'll get onto in a minute. And it's worth saying that there are kind of practical considerations here as well, because this is overlapping with something that we are already doing, which kind of further sort of directs what we're interested in. So by way of background, for those of you who may not have heard of siege culture, it helps to think about it as a kind of globalized subculture. Ideologically, people often apply labels like accelerationist, which for my money is maybe slightly misleading, but you know, we can talk about that in the Q&A if people are interested. Other labels that people have applied: universal order, which is a term that you'll find embedded in the literature itself. Sometimes they might talk about themselves as being future fascists or futurist fascists, which is a reference to kind of the futurism movement. And it's something supposedly quite distinct from what's come before. There's a central ideological text from which the subculture derives its name, Siege, by the American neo-Nazi James Mason. And although kind of there are plenty of books, it's worth saying that the heart of the scene, if you like, is online. It's kind of moved around a bit over the years, but it's certainly on a digital platform called Telegram. Previously, it's been centered heavily on a web forum called Iron March. There's also usually kind of an accompanying website still in existence. It used to be Siege Culture, but that's kind of changed its name a couple of times and moved around, and it's quite difficult to follow. One thing that does stand out about siege culture kind of globally is it has this unique aesthetic. So it's always kind of very obvious when you're looking at siege culture content. As you can see by the image on the right, that is kind of someone's attempt to sort of distill down siege into posters that work on Telegram. But that kind of dark, certainly black and red palette, everybody's armed. There's usually a quote, but it's quite visual, it's quite designed. It is almost immediately recognizable. So in terms of how it played out specifically in the UK, going from that global subculture to how it was implemented in the UK, we have probably the premier vehicle in the UK for this scene was National Action. They kind of predate it to some extent, but they were there kind of for the rise of it before National Action were prescribed in 2016. It's been a more obvious influence on what you might think of as the successor groups to National Action. So that's included some bits of National Action that tried to rebrand themselves and were ultimately prescribed. And then since then, two groups, Sonnenkrieg, which was a UK-based group, and then Führerkrieg, which was a far more kind of international outfit, but had a couple of UK sort of followers. So I said before, this was a case of most interest. The reason this is of interest is in the UK, we have a designation for people convicted of terrorism or terrorism-related offences. We call them TACT offenders. Quite what that stands for, I can never quite remember, but there are around about 45 or so far-right inspired TACT offenders in the UK. And that's just based on sort of journalistic reporting. And it's a little hard to be sure. These things are never entirely cut and dry, but around about 30 of those TACT offenders are probably in some way related to either siege culture or National Action specifically. So this is generating a huge amount of the far-right counter-terrorism caseload in the UK. So the other kind of point that I really want to draw out is this emphasis on subcultures. For those of you that have been around in terrorism studies for a while, you'll know that subcultures have been used before. There's a couple of sort of broad interpretations, if you like, and neither of them are mutually exclusive. So the first I would say is kind of drawing on the criminological idea of a subculture and going back to the roots of a subculture is kind of explaining criminal behavior and why people kind of become, in the language of the time, deviants. And that's been applied to radicalization. And it's, extremely useful work. So there's people like, I'm going to mispronounce this name, and I do apologize for that, but Boucher and Lang and Holt as well have kind of done some work around sort of subcultures as venues for radicalization, this idea of enculturation into a subculture. There's an alternative perspective as well, which is probably less well developed, but it kind of takes its cue from subcultural studies more generally. So people like Ken Gelder or Dick Hebdige or so on. So proper sort of social studies, I guess. So people like Hemming have applied this kind of lens to kind of jihadists. People like Gilbert Ramsey have kind of strayed into this territory as well. But it's more interested in kind of extremist subcultures as social spaces. In the words of Ken Gelder, groups of people with non-normative interests. Well, that kind of fits siege culture, and it's quite a helpful way, I think, of conceptualizing the scene, which gets us away from this sort of radicalization paradigm, which I know is important, but tends to sometimes obscure a little bit about what's important, and it lets us kind of focus on sort of the more ephemeral, the norms, the aesthetics, and sort of the ways of being, which aren't always immediately apparent. So moving on to kind of I guess what you call the findings. This is very much a work in progress, so this is always being refined, but I talked about these kind of four distinct periods of how this has played out in the UK. So if you go way back to 2013, you can start thinking about sort of the origins, if you like, of siege culture, and that is National Action. And essentially, at the time, National Action was formed by one current student and one former student. They were young, they were university educated. They looked around at the landscape in the UK, which at the time was sort of dominated by either the EDL, which is ideologically slightly different, or the British National Party, which was kind of in its descendancy a little bit. It had kind of lost out in elections. It wasn't really going anywhere fast. It had this kind of sort of Janus-based approach to politics, where you had to kind of moderate your extremism, and the youth wing was constantly being reinvented, and it was a bit of a joke, as the image of the young man in the night costume might help people to understand. They had a particularly disastrous video that did the rounds on YouTube as well, which was basically a bunch of young nationalists humiliating themselves and being mocked online. It was a bit of a disaster. So the kids that founded National Action looked at this and said, no, that's not for us. And they wanted to do something different. They wanted to really shake it up. They wanted to kind of be as far apart from the BNP and the EDL as they could. So they put an emphasis on discipline, on presentation, and they really went at it like a marketing project. They even released this document, Strategy and Promotion. They were using the language of the market to really talk about themselves and how they wanted to present themselves. There was a massive emphasis on youth. In essence, if you were over 30, they probably wouldn't even respond to your emails. They were kind of, I've written legitimacy seeking, and that might seem a bit egregious given sort of what happened since, but certainly they didn't set out to be a terrorist organization. They didn't set out to do clandestine illegal things. It was an emphasis on kind of edgy yet kind of mostly legal protest, I would say, in the beginning. That's not to say there weren't other things either going on individually or behind the scenes. What also kind of comes out from some of this early kind of marketing approach is how interested they were in what was going on overseas. So they were particularly looking to the Russian scene, and also the German scene as well, and particularly a group called the Autonomous Nationalists, which some of you may have come across. And in this kind of early period as well, people from National Action were active on a web forum called Iron March, and there was plenty of kind of like international exchange going on there. Brandon Russell, who would go on to found Atomwaffen Division, actually, apparently, according to Graham Macklin and some other people, came to the UK for a visit with some members of National Action. And so there was this kind of international exchange going on. So fast forward to around about 2016, 2017, National Action is prescribed in December 2016. At the same time, there are shifts happening on Iron March, and particularly the book Siege is being kind of rediscovered. So it resurfaces on Iron March. And if anyone's familiar with Siege, you'll know it's an amazingly American book. So it's written by an American with lots of references to American pop culture, people like Charles Manson, and is certainly kind of, it's based on the experiences of the American neo-Nazi scene and its perceived failings. And in essence, it kind of tied in with everything National Action were trying to do. It was saying, movements are not to be tricked with. They're not trustworthy. They don't work. We need to be uncompromising. We need to kind of focus in on kind of our truth, on the organic state, on the universal order. So it's a heavily American thing. It has ideas in it which overlap with kind of this rejection of sort of failed approaches to the extreme right. And it's also compatible with other ideas that are present on Iron March at this time. This idea of futurism, accelerationism, the idea that we need to kind of burn down the system and put something new in its place, and this kind of zero tolerance concept. The idea that, here on Iron March, we're not like the alt-right. We don't want to be kind of playful and friendly and well, maybe not friendly, but, we take our politics a little bit more seriously than that. If anyone was studying the alt-right around about this time, you might have seen this Read Siege meme, which was kind of almost constantly on the periphery of kind of the alt-right. It was constantly there in the background, and that was basically, where it was coming from. So in terms of how it played out in the UK, the successor groups to some extent, but maybe the splinter groups to some extent, but definitely the successor groups, they followed far more closely this Atomwaffen Division Iron March template. So there's an example of some Sonnenkrieg propaganda there, and it's got that kind of characteristic color palette. It's a little brighter, but it's got that color palette, very reminiscent of the style of a propagandist called Dark Foreigner, who used to do a lot of work for Atomwaffen Division, not all of it, but a lot of it. And it's very much obvious that there's kind of the re-importing ideas from this global subculture into the UK and kind of mapping themselves after that. So this is just a graph from the SPLC, which helps to remind everybody that Iron March and Siege were not always synonymous. It was something that kind of developed over time, which is always worth bearing in mind. So fast forward again to, around about the end of 2017, the dates on this are not exact, so I apologize for that, but it is very difficult given the context. And you get what I like to think of as the satanic panic. And we all know occultism of various stripes, or paganism, or different kind of forms of religion have had a long tradition in the extreme right. But there was a particular incident where texts linked to a Satanist sect called the Order of the Nine Angles, which, if you believe the myths, kind of originated in the UK to begin with. But they were imported or added to the Atomwaffen division reading list by Atomwaffen's then new leader, which sparked an outcry, which is understandable if you've kind of engaged with the material. It is intentionally confusing, but kind of one of the doctrines is the idea that you should infiltrate extreme groups to kind of harness the sinister energy. It's a little bit out there, but if you are a member of Atomwaffen division, you can start to see why people may be slightly suspicious of all this Satanism stuff that's going on. And you get kind of quite a strong reaction to that. Someone posts a long essay kind of outing John Cameron Denton, who was then the leader of Atomwaffen division, as being a Satanist. Iron March disbanded for reasons never fully explained, but we have some guesses about. And it was replaced by another web forum called Fascist Forge, which was far more about religion. That's basically all they did. They spent endless amounts of time arguing about specific religions. They banned all Christian fascists. Everybody had their own kind of bizarre interpretation, and it got more and more kind of navel gazing. So it's a little bit of a kind of downward turn, if you like, for the scene. And this kind of plays out in the UK as well. I mean, this is the bit that we have less information about, but you start to see kind of Satanist stuff showing up in the caseload. You start to get it kind of being a feature of cases a little bit, and it certainly crops up in groups like Sonnenkrieg to quite some extent. And then the pandemic hits, and where we are now is a phrase I like to use, is post-organizational. I borrowed that from a guy called Joe Mulhall, who researches for Hope Not Hate in the UK, but he uses this term post-organizational, which I think sums up where we are quite well. So now, you know, even the American group seems to have gone down the tubes to some extent. Atomwaffen division has disbanded and kind of reinvented itself multiple times. The base has been exposed, if not completely finished off. Führerkrieg division again has been exposed. The fact that the leader was a 13-year-old meant that they've not been able to entirely shut him down, it seems. Fascist Forge goes offline in 2020. In the UK, the convictions are stacking up. You get to this kind of 30+ figure. There are kind of cases in progress as well, I think. And so at the same time, you start to get new ideas doing the rounds, particularly on Telegram. And there's two texts which kind of stand out. One is a short essay called How to Assemble Your Squad, which kind of says, you know, all these organizations were a mistake. We need to go back to kind of first principles. We need to organize locally. We need to use people that you know, that trust, that you can rely on. You need to recruit in your bowling league and your church group, which I imagine would lead to some very awkward conversations. A second text, and this came out literally just a few months ago, but it's quite noticeable, is a book called Militant Accelerationism. It was published in multiple languages nearly simultaneously on Telegram for a channel that seemed to be explicitly designed for that purpose. And it's partway between fiction, an art project, and a terrorist manual. It's an extraordinary document. To kind of give you a flavor, this is sort of an image which is taken out of part of one page. But basically the caption reads, James Mason, author of Siege, Mike Marr, who authored a book called Harassment Architecture, a similar, well, another ideologue in the scene, if you like, aren't coming to knock the power out, that's on you. And the book is full of stuff like this, right? It's about, you know, forget your ideology, here's some stuff that you can be doing right now with some simple equipment. You know, the one phrase that really stands out in the book is fire is free. And so it's almost like they are relearning the lessons that were originally learned in the 1980s and the 1990s. They are kind of putting out material which is less ideological, it's less navel gazing, it's less about what specific branch of the left-hand path you're walking, and it's far more de-ideologized, which I'm not entirely sure is a word, so apologies for that. But it places a huge emphasis on mobilization, on practice, and on really kind of getting out there and doing something locally rather than mucking around with these groups and these propaganda videos. And it's almost like they've relearned the lessons of kind of leaderless resistance that led to that idea that, you know, we need to do things individually, but we need to have kind of this central ideological platform so everyone's on the same page. So if you are interested in kind of terrorist threat emanating from this space, you would do well to think about it in terms of things like stochastic terrorism, which is a quite a helpful term. Sometimes you can think about it as entrepreneurial violence, the idea that you have kind of lone actors, but they are kind of cued in to this global subculture. They are inspired. So I'm coming up on the end of the time I've got, so I'll just kind of wrap up now. I mean, the main points, this is very much a work in progress. I'm trying to work to refine it, and I get that the subcultural kind of stages is a little bit of kind of inside baseball, but I think there are a few kind of lessons here that are relevant for the wider study. So the first thing is that kind of this emphasis on subculture, I think, is useful because it helps us to think beyond groups and to be slightly more inclusive in what we consider, right? So it is about aesthetics, it is about behaviors and worldviews, it is about kind of people interacting outside of group hierarchies. The second point, and kind of hopefully is clear in the findings, is that the siege culture in the UK is dynamic. It evolves over time. It's not a static thing. It's kind of got a precursor and it's got a post phase, and it's ever changing. The third thing is it evolves in exchanges with the wider subculture that happens to be at the moment American dominated, but you can see these exchanges happening all the time. They're reaching out to kind of the autonomous nationalists. They're reaching out via Iron March, kind of they're spreading their stuff into Iron March and they're importing other ideas. And that's kind of there in the process of Americanization. They always kind of make us bolt on this sort of so what bit as well. So I'll try and make this kind of relevant for any sort of practitioners or policymakers or whatever. I would say the main finding here is that you know, going back to that stuff around the cultic milieu, if anyone's ever kind of engaged with that literature, is that, you know, the subcultures are persistent, whereas the organizations tend to be temporary and ephemeral. So kind of we want to focus on kind of maybe a slightly wider field than just the narrow organizations that tend to disappear and change their name. Second thing is stuff that tends to get written off as ephemera.
We might have to cut it off
it
there.
All manners.
We're a little bit over now. But
okay, I will stop there then. In that case, you can read the rest.
We will get back to this, I think, in Q&A, because I really do want to hear you talk about the so what, and I think so do numerous people in the audience, particularly those who do come from practitioner backgrounds. So we do have to move on to our next speakers. So our next speakers today are Dr. Helen Young. So Dr. Helen Young is a lecturer in writing and literature with Deakin University, and she's here today with co-author Dr. Geoff Boucher, who's an associate professor of writing and literature, also at Deakin University. And they'll be talking to us today on far-right fictions.
Great, thank you. So it is just me talking, and apologies, I don't have PowerPoint. So you'll have to look at me. So we're going to do three things in this paper. The first is to establish some connections between far-right accelerationist groups and fictions, we want to then provide a brief account of the history of accelerationist fictions and of the capacity of fiction in general that make it a useful tool for the far right. And then finally, we want to offer some insights into the specific capacities of print on demand and digitally published fictions for accelerationists. And this includes algorithm-driven circulation. And we're drawing there on some preliminary results from a pilot study of accelerationist fictions that we're doing at the moment. So before going further, I want to offer this account of far-right accelerationism. So accelerationism is the intellectual and political movement that is very significant in the far right today. It's best described as an insurgency strategy that complements the political millenarianism and apocalyptic religious doctrines that are native to the extreme right. Although accelerationism originated in the left, in libertarianism, its focus on eugenics and hostility to democracy make it completely compatible with white supremacy and neo-Nazi politics. The idea behind accelerationist thinking is straightforward, as opposed to by the Atomwaffen division indicates. It says, sure, it's going to collapse, but can't it hurry up? Their plan is to accelerate the supposedly impending disintegration of society through acts of terrorism that intensify and quicken the spiral into chaos, because on the fascist analysis, the best hope for the construction of a white supremacist state in the soon-to-be former USA is a situation of ungovernability. So much of the thinking and related fictions come from and are focused on the US, but UK, New Zealand, and Australia have also seen accelerationism emerge. So far-right extremists have a decades-long history of strategizing and seeking to recruit through literature, from William Pierce's The Turner Diaries and Hunter, which were published in the 70s and 80s, through an expanding raft of contemporary accelerationist fictions in the present. So the novels of American and British neo-Nazis, including The Turner Diaries, Colin Jordan's Merry England 2000, that's 1993, and The Uprising, and David Lane's KD Rebel from 2001, and also the books of Harold Covington, have received some attention from researchers, which points in useful directions for exploration of the function and significance of accelerationist fictions. Much of the attention from researchers to far-right fictions is grounded in the established significance of the authors in the far right when they actually wrote the books. In our current era of easy, pseudonymous digital self-publication through platforms like Amazon, this is a faulty foundation on which to build an understanding of far-right fictions generally, or accelerationist fictions in particular. Researchers working on media cultures and counterterrorism have devoted considerable attention to the connections between social media platforms, encrypted messaging apps, and emergent terrorist groups. Surprisingly, though, there's no scholarship exists on the ways in which right-wing radicals and extremists have taken advantage of digital book publishing. This is striking because the far right today, the novel has arguably replaced the manifesto for propaganda, recruitment, and strategy. Nowhere is this more evident than in recently arrested neo-Nazi terrorist groups that describe themselves as accelerationists. So Atomwaffen and Division and the Base are the most salient examples. Despite networking in part through gaming communities and communicating through encrypted messaging, these groups were inspired by electronically circulated and print-on-demand books. So literature plays a critical role in accelerationism. So the Base, an accelerationist group that's oriented towards terrorist actions designed to spark a war of secession in the Pacific Northwest of the USA, in order to set up a white supremacist statelet. So it's recruited actively in other countries as well, including Australia, with ultimately the same sort of white nationalist purpose. So the accelerationism of the Base took the form, for example, of a plot to perform a false flag attack on a pro-gun rally in Richmond, Virginia. They proposed to be disguised as Antifa or BLM activists in order to trigger nationwide armed reprisals against left-wing groups by armed right-wing militias. This basic strategy was inspired by the Northwest Trilogy +1, the neo-Nazi novels of the founder of the fascist Northwest Alliance, Harold Covington. So these novels, A Distant Thunder, A Mighty Fortress, The Brigade, and Freedom's Son, which were published over about a decade, beginning in 2004, they map out a strategy for the creation of what Covington called the Northwest Republic, from moving from guerrilla warfare in book 1 through liberated zones in book 2 to regional insurrection in book 3 and finally state formation in book 4. Pierce's The Turner Diaries has also inspired, is very well known, acts of far-right terror that had accelerationist aims, even if the specific political position and the term attached to it was not yet articulated when he was writing. So Pierce, Covington, and then contemporary authors in sort of from the late 70s through into the first decade of the 2000s authored what we might call the taproot fictions of contemporary accelerationism. Although, as I said, the particular term and concept for the political strategy hadn't yet been developed when they were writing. So non-fiction books also emerged in the late 20th century, so including Mason's The Siege, Tom Chittim's Civil War II, and a bit later Jack Donovan's The Way of Men, which is advocates masculine tribalism, supposed natural domination, and misogynistic male homosexuality as a response to the catastrophic degeneration of modern life that Doniphan thinks should be intensified to breakdown by violence. So at the time it was published, he was a member of the Odinist neo-Nazi group, the Wolves of Finland. So recent years have seen a slew of accelerationist fictions alongside and sometimes crossing over with far-right secessionist and survivalist fictions published both pseudonymously and by known members of the far right. So Mike Marr, a one-time ghostwriter for Milo Yiannopoulos, wrote Harassment Architecture, that came out in 2019. It's a fictionalized lone wolf rage fantasy that justifies hate crimes in a degenerate civilization on the basis of a quick roundup of the usual suspects of the culture wars, so equal opportunity, political correctness, racial miscegenation, sexual harassment laws, and male sexual frustration. A recent follow-up, Gothic Violence, sees a band of terrorist surfers take over Florida amid the chaos caused by their violence. Vince McLeod's Clown World Chronicles, The Human Primate in the 21st Century, that's also 2021, spells a similar sort of scenario out in a hate-filled ambience of masculine domination and racial prejudice that explicitly invokes acceleration as its central answer to modern artificiality. So I want to talk a little bit now about why fiction, why this is useful for far-right purposes. So Paul Jackson's account of the effects of neo-Nazi fiction is a useful starting point for understanding how fiction serves extremist political purposes. And I'm quoting him here. Such texts give license to hold extreme views, which at the very least help to make violent action appear morally justified and even desirable. They offer license to hate, and often a programmatic message of a national revolutionary elite being the only force able to overthrow a corrupt government. Such messages can be and are circulated in non-fiction as well, of course, but both researchers and extremists recognise that fiction can research and influence readers that political screeds will not, and they function in different ways. So fictions humanise and personalise political theories and strategies, creating a coherent, real textual world. This is significant in relation to the substantial conspiratorial elements of potentially accelerationist novels. So some of the material I'm going to talk about later, it's not actually clear whether the author sort of personally subscribes to an accelerationist position. In an analysis of the possible affinities between fiction and conspiracy, Umberto Eco argues that quite ordinary techniques of narrative construction mean that fictions are structured like conspiracies, and that conspiracies are conversely structured like fictions. Fictions are often a profound simplification of reality that present an historical and social world through the actions of a limited number of agents whose decisions and relations make a difference to what happens in that context. In this respect, it's extremely difficult to differentiate on solely formal grounds between a fiction passage and a conspiracy belief. Fictions that represent conspiracies such as takeover of the US government by a secret group of hostile outsiders reinforce the feeling of truthfulness of any particular theory. In short, when they align even broadly with a reader's existing beliefs, those beliefs are reinforced, even though the status of the text as a fiction, that is not fact, is recognised. So fictions also enable and encourage identification with the protagonist, including through narrative empathy, as Suzanne Keane argues. This can include empathy with the protagonist's emotions, moral judgments, and ethical positions. So fictions can then function to legitimise, normalise, and validate far-right accelerationist ideology, strategies, and actions through constructions of a truth-like world that the reader can connect to. So I want to talk quickly about technology. So for people like authors like William Pearce, face some challenges with conventional book publishing. So Covington had a few things to say about this, reflecting on Pearce's and his own experience. So basically, he outlines the challenges that he and other far-right authors faced in conventional publishing markets right at the end of the 90s. So all of these he blamed on supposed Jewish control of the industry. So this included things like securing an agent, the costs of printing, circulation and distribution. So he's writing this in 1999, but 4 years later in 2003, he extols the benefits of what he calls print per order self-publishing, that is print on demand, for what he termed racial fictions, including his own lifetime's worth of novels. This allowed, as he observed, circumvention of the need for capital to fund printing and storage, avoided the challenges of reprints that had hampered circulation of earlier novels. Ironclad contracts absolve the publisher of any responsibility for content, and this, along with their pursuit of profits and the fictional nature of the books themselves, were credited by Covington with allowing him to escape censorship. So the company that still publishes his novels, iUniverse, did everything to get them published, from typesetting to basic marketing and listing them for sale through major mainstream outlets, including Amazon and Barnes & Noble. And this now includes ebook and print versions through Google Play and Amazon as well. So Pearce and Covington's novels circulate very widely, including in free PDF downloads, alongside numerous other far-right works of both fiction and non-fiction through Red Pill servers, white nationalist reading rooms, and also, and this is what I'm going to turn to now, the sales algorithms of Amazon and Google Play. So those algorithms take customers beyond the works that are authored by known far-right figures and accelerationists to a raft of seemingly mainstream novels in the adventure/thriller genre that could be easily read as imitations of Tom Clancy or Matthew Riley books, but nonetheless construct fundamentally accelerationist scenarios. So at the start of our exploration of accelerationist fictions, we created a new Amazon account and explored what was suggested based on what other customers who had purchased Pearce's The Turner Diaries and Hunter, Covington's Northwest series, Mason Siege, the works of Donovan, MacLeod and others had also bought. So the algorithm also leads back the other way, suggesting known far-right and accelerationist works based on common purchase to customers who look at the more sort of mainstream novels. So we found an array of books with dystopian scenarios or utopian ones from an accelerationist perspective. And we've compiled a list of more than 20 authors for the pilot study. And they're often people who have penned really long series. So I think I'm getting a little low on time here, so I'm not going to give you specific names and scenarios, but I will draw a couple of sort of common threads out in a moment. So key questions for us in testing these novels for far-right accelerationism as the project progresses are whether they advocate right-wing authoritarianism, and whether their social analysis of modernity involves diagnosis of society as a degenerating civilization, and whether they propose the intensification of alienation to the point of social collapse via political violence as a form of ethical renewal. As our project develops, we're investigating whether the authors can be linked to known accelerationist groups. Some of them are. We know that some of them are not, or we don't know. But the nature of fiction and its capacities for narrativizing political ideologies and strategies mean that the overt or even conscious affiliations of the author are in some senses less significant than the content of the text themselves, because the capacities that fiction has to represent something truth-like in a way that can generate empathy in the readers. So I'll just close with some preliminary observations about the fictions that we've drawn out of the Amazon algorithm. So the novels variously feature political oppression, wars of succession, post-apocalyptic survivalism, and a range of sort of social collapse triggers. So ranging from equal opportunity, gun control, ethnic fracturing, and a apparent crime spiral. But they agree that modern Western civilization is somehow degenerate and irredeemably crumbling. In both these differences and the core common theme, there are significant parallels with known fascist novels, such as those of Pierce and Covington. Variations on the conspiracy theories that underpin contemporary American neo-Nazi movements feature in significant number. So really noticeably controlled by the Zionist occupied government or similar nefarious secret global forces. And they use global as a sort of anti-Semitic catchphrase, buzzword. So often that takes the form of United Nations or sometimes Chinese agents, and white genocide is also a really common theme. A key point is that the narrative trajectories of these breakdown novels are all resolved through violence, often by individuals or militia rather than by the military. And that violence becomes political when the characters are forced to decide on the nature of the republic in which they wish to live. The aim of the protagonists in the books that we have looked at so far can be reasonably summarised by David Lane's 14 words. So we must secure the existence of our people and a future for white children. What we seem to have then is a potentially vast array of fictions that construct and reinforce white supremacist and accelerationist worldviews circulating widely and freely. Given our methodology of beginning with works known to be associated with far-right accelerationism, our results at this stage are reasonably predictable. If these books existed, then the Amazon recommendation algorithm would find them. These are the books that people who buy Pierce, Covington, Mason, Donovan and their ilk also purchase. But as I said, the relationship is two-way, and buying these novels will lead readers already primed by their content to the writings, both fictional and more overtly political, of violent extremists. I'll wrap it up there. Thanks.
Thank you for that, Helen. That was a fascinating conversation, and I've written down some questions, so you'll be getting some from me after this, because I think there's a lot there to explore. It's my pleasure to turn to our last presentation for this particular session. This is going to be presented by Jade Hutchinson, and I think support from Julian Droogan. So Jade is a university student with Macquarie University, PhD candidate with Macquarie University, and he's also affiliated with Droogan University in the Netherlands. Dr. Julian Droogan is a senior lecturer of terrorism studies at Macquarie University, and together they've been working on research which explores social media algorithms and online extremism. Do you want to take that away, Jade?
Sure. Where are we? Just share my screen. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Christy, for the introduction. Today, we will be presenting some of the key findings following our examination of reaction usage among Australian and Canadian right-wing extremist groups on Facebook from 2016 to 2019. And reactions are those little emoji icons, that we all use to interact with posts and symbolize our emotional expression, like the emojis that you see on the slide in front of you. Toward the end of this presentation, we will focus on how socio-technical systems that underlie and operate Facebook likely affected these trends in online behavior and may even propel the problem of online extremism. So over the last 10 years, social media platforms like Facebook have become a place where extremist dialogue and content are shared and popularized. At times, Facebook has been an important instrument and source of influence for right-wing extremist communities, a place where users can react and mobilize around certain themes and narratives. But research is mostly focused on extremist groups in the United States and Europe, particularly how these groups use themes and narratives, but far less is known about which features of social media platforms most or least appeal to users when interacting with such extremist content, or how such features may influence a user's interpretation of the themes and narratives present, or how this is being experienced within the Australian context and elsewhere. So our aim was to assess the frequency and proportionate use of every reaction across a nationwide and ideologically sub-movement sample. We wanted to find out why certain reactions were commonly assigned to certain right-wing extremist themes and narratives in Facebook. And one of our findings was that we found that reactions are a generative mechanism. They're made to encourage user engagement and meaning making. And as such, they may be unwittingly reaffirming the moral intuitions of extremist goals into populations and make them seem as reasonable. So, although emotions are fleeting constructions, they remain crucial mental states that have a profound effect on our psychological interior and intersubjective agreements with one another. Among other contributions to personhood, emotions do guide decision-making processes and moral judgment. They can serve as a heuristic that helps us to appraise and remember our interactions with others and signal whether someone is behaving as expected. This is not to imply that reactions are an accurate representation of emotion or that a reaction itself is an accurate tell for a person's psychological state. However, we do consider whether reactions prompt a user to both resonate with and frame the content using an emotion concept, influencing their interpretation of what is happening, who is involved, and perhaps how to treat them. If moved by this framing, a person's moral intuition is likely to be regulated by its affect, and the post hoc reasoning that they would accrue accredits the pre-existing set of expectations and even justifies behavioral responses, again, in ways that to them may seem reasonable. In this sense, emotions play a pivotal regulatory role in shaping each person's moral reality while viewing narratives online, including determining who may be an us and who is a them. As Helen well articulated, right-wing extremist narratives are devised and circulated to channel and coalesce sort of shared meaning and emotion to advance certain schemas of moral reasoning. While online, such narratives live on, right, via the content posted in places like Facebook, and emotionally bait visiting users to consider the cultural norms and goals espoused by that ideological narrative. And as we suggest, Facebook's reactions as a feature that enables users to interact with an ideology, an ideological narrative may incrementally shape their moral intuition over time in ways that is convincing. So the most common set of emojis represent an emotion or expression, a living being, or an inanimate object. Participants in digital communication studies often characterize emojis as familiar, cute, imaginative, expressive, accurate, intimate, and meaningful. And this characterization highlights just how effective, right, emojis can be at inviting feelings and describing personality traits, of course, depending on its use. And when it is used, emojis have a referential function, which is where a single or multiple emojis can generate a broad spectrum of meaning, right, that varies depending on the cultural context and the user's reading, amongst other things. And this can functionally represent an adjective, a verb, or even an entire proposition, like the three emojis placed in a row there at the bottom of the slide. So in February 2016, Facebook introduced a small selection of emoji-based options called reactions that afford a user the ability to promptly and communally symbolize their emotional response to a post. In contrast to the remaining 3,000 emojis, reactions are aesthetically consistent across devices that have the Facebook application, and they also feature a brief videographic preview of the emotion being selected for. Also, unlike the emojis that stock, each of our digital keyboards, reactions limit users to one of 6 emotional extremes, right, and inhibits us from partnering it with a linguistic phrase unless we engage in the post in an additional way. So the qualities and utility of reactions are conditioned by the individual's perception of the reaction, which is influenced by, as I said, the cultural context and product to which it is assigned. if we, and we sort of thought that, if certain patterns in online expression are found to endure subtle changes in culture over time and extend beyond boundaries of one or another online community, and are even similarly assigned to certain contexts and objects, right, that are of importance to that community, like this may suggest that there's a shared, emotional, moral repertoire, right, specific to that object or identity or context in question. And understanding what signals are communicated in online extremist communities, what objects are they signaling towards, and through what online features are they communicating those signals most often. It is necessary to know this in order to then appraise, what effect those signals might have, or as features, what are they intending to do, or what is the character of the community's relationship to that object or identity or context. And in the case of right-wing extremism, the qualities of each reaction are likely viewed in part through the lens of the beholder's ideology. And the utility of each of its extra-linguistic proposition is pertinent when assigned to an ideological narrative. Given the examples on screen, right, consider which reaction a sympathetic follower of far-right extremism is likely to select in response to a post that depicts an outgroup, right? And if a user resonates with this framing, the observer is encouraged to select a reaction that aligns with the outgroup norms and the objectives upheld by the ideology.
Yeah, so thanks, Jade. So I'll talk a bit more now about the method that we employed in this research, and in trying to understand how the platform itself, how Facebook and the social media experience shaped far-right users' experiences, but also shaped those movements online. We conducted a cross-national comparative analysis of administrator and user online behaviour. We looked at 59 different Facebook groups, both Australian and Canadian right-wing extremist group accounts. The data was collected between 2016 and 19, and it was quite a substantial data set. We ended up with just under 100,000 posts from these far-right Facebook group pages, and about 4,500 or so uses of the Facebook reactions. And so drawing on this corpus, we assessed the frequency and the proportionate use of reactions across two different layers of analysis. First, we did it by nation between Australia and Canada, and then we did it by the ideological sub-movement of that particular far-right group, or right-wing extremist group, if you prefer. Now, groups were coded by whether they were Australian or Canadian, and also on whether the group was predominantly, one, anti-Islamic, two, more cultural superiority focused, or three, focused more around racial superiority in their ideology. And this macro level assessment was paired with then a very in-depth qualitative analysis of the most popular types of posts, the most popular types of themes and the narratives that we saw that accompanied these reaction usages across the data sample. So based on this analysis, we then reasoned why certain reactions were commonly assigned to certain right-wing extremist themes and narratives. And so you can see on the screen, these graphs represent the results of reaction usage for all of the Australian and the Canadian groups over 3 years of activity on Facebook. Now, we don't have the time to talk about all the findings, but a few key points that we can highlight here are, first of all, that in the nationwide sample, users of Australian groups reused a much narrower cast of reactions, mostly just anger, the ha-ha or laugh, and also the heart, love reactions, while Canadian groups employed much more proportionate use of reactions across those that were available to them. Now, across both the Australian and the Canadian samples, the anger reaction, perhaps unsurprisingly, was the most popular, the most commonly assigned to narratives in particular that framed a negative or a threatening outgroup of some sort. And this certainly aligns with other studies and wider studies of social media engagement among Australian, also German, right-wing extremist communities on Facebook, also on Twitter and Reddit, that have all found that negative emotional responses to outgroup identities to be some of the most popular types of user engagement across those far-right groups. But there are also differences that existed in the sample. So these graphs represent the results of reaction usage across the racial superiority groups in both Australia and Canada, respectively. Users within the Australian groups frequently reacted to content using the ha-ha, about 40%, while Canadian groups employed anger, almost 70%. Why would certain reactions appear more than others? Well, and we think this is most important. Facebook did announce that they weighted reactions more than likes to help guide the platform's algorithms when deciding what content will appear and reappear in a user's news feeds. So this is not happening in a vacuum, of course, happening on a social media platform. And Facebook's architecture, its software, and also its business model are all playing in to how the far right are expressing themselves in these different contexts. And this means that when a reaction is assigned to a post, this partnership, it not only produces an ambiguous and also potentially violent proposition, but similar posts are much more likely then to reappear in the user's newsfeed, and that of other users who are predicted to pay attention to these types of posts. So it's actually generating the social relationships and also the narratives and the ideologies and the mental states that the people using these platforms are generating. Now, across both nationwide samples, the anger reaction was most often assigned to anti-other narratives. This aligns with previous research highlighting that othered identities such as Muslims and Islamic, the concept of being a liberal, for instance, feature among the most used terms by administrators in the groups on Facebook. These identities were framed as a negative or threatening presence within society, and users who resonated with this framing were likely to reciprocate with the anger face, the anger reaction. Now, this makes sense. Right-wing extremism is an exclusivist ideology, of course, captured within an anti-democratic, a puritanical and authoritarian sentiment, motivated by visions that we've just heard, two great accounts, visions of social dominance. And the other is, of course, perceived as the embodied evidence of a society's degradation. Extremists respond aggressively to the perceived encroachment and integration of the other in society. A right-wing extremist community or group's entire purpose can be found really in anti-other values and activities. And such groups and communities brandish the other with accusations of being contaminated, impure, disproportionately responsible for crimes, deviancy, corruption, and being basically incompatible with society. Now, real or imagined, the others are intuitively regarded as harmful or threatening. So this framing offers reasoning for the popular partnership then, of course, between other and anger, the partnership between the anger emotion and the use of that reaction and anti-other narratives on the Facebook pages. Importantly, should mention that just because people are posting the emoji or the reaction of anger doesn't mean necessarily that it makes them angry to do so. Then they will be doing it and maybe making them feel good or positive or reinforcing those social bonds they have with others online. Now, narratives, events, or persons that positively reflected a right-wing extremist identity or value were also commonly assigned the love reaction, and positive affirmation to one's identity and values invites moments of shared affection and feelings of belonging within that very highly social milieu online. And within the context of right-wing extremist ideology, one's national, cultural, racial identity serves as a claim to various entitlements, to privileges, to expectations and positive treatment. As an object of extreme affection, the in-group identity can function as a locus of pro-sociality, celebration, and companionship. Now, these inward-focused narratives revealed an attempt to arouse viewers' sympathy as a fellow victim, or encourage them to identify as someone who ought to care for the values, ideals, and the consequences that have befallen their community, or to press upon the viewer to pledge themselves to protect a more strict, perhaps, boundary between us and them, to police that boundary more closely. And this, again, also aligns with wider research that finds that words like Australia, Canada, white, people, and so on, to be some of the most popular terms that administrators use on their group pages in Facebook to create that sense of sociality, belonging, and common purpose.
Sure, thank you, Julian. I've just been told that we really have about 4 or so minutes left. So I might skip this slide, which basically outlined the characteristics of personalization algorithm on Facebook. And of course, we can return back to this during question time if need be. So I might just quickly focus on some of the takeaways from our analysis. And as we well know, there are many studies, including some of the previous panels actually that have been presented here, and they highlight the virality and effect of extremist narratives on social media and the subsequent proliferation of misinformation and political polarization and negative judgment. However, extremist storylines are not the only thing that are circulated on a user's newsfeed, but the various features that are affixed to each post. And as Julian mentioned, users in Australian and Canadian group accounts left distinct patterns in engagement, with anger and anti-other narratives ranked as one of the most popular pairings, between these two things. Except even if, the initial use of reaction is considered, neutral, if there is such a thing, the algorithm still attributes their habit of reaction use as an indicator of engagement, and preferentially allocates certain posts in the future, presenting numerous opportunities to entangle emotion concepts and ideological narratives, leading a follower's moral intuition, to perhaps entertain the belief on offer. So therefore, during the time frame of analysis, algorithms created by this company manipulated the frequency, duration, and intensity in which this pairing of anger and anti-other narratives appeared in these groups to propel their respective patterns of engagement. So in trying to manipulate the viewpoints and the interactive features in the newsfeed, Facebook not only conditions each user's interpretation of the ideological narrative, creating these incremental shifts in personhood, but over time it may actually contribute to a wider emotional moral repertoire within these groups and communities. And so we understand that identifying any sort of causal role specific to an emotional experience and how that might play in a violent extremist behavior is nearly impossible to capture, right? But in an age where violent extremism is increasingly contingent on social media, both as a commemorative tool, right, for inculcating identity templates and viewpoints, understanding online extremism as purely conditioned by preternatural beliefs may be misleading. And this is because social media wields this bi-directional influence on violent extremists and everyone else that operates on the platform. It facilitates an extremist intention to action their belief while simultaneously shaping their intentions and affecting their beliefs. So this is where we posit that Facebook's reactions, not only contribute to user engagement and resonance and meaning with extremist narratives, but may even reaffirm the moral intuitions of extremist goals, again, as reasonable. And this is where I'd like to just conclude by saying that this, of course, wouldn't be possible without various colleagues. We're truly fortunate to collaborate with and who have contributed, of course, to the results and ideas presented here. So we sincerely look forward to your questions and discussion. I'll end the sharing.
Perfect, Jade. Thank you. That was right on time. Very well done. Thank you to everyone that's presented in this particular session. I think we've been treated, in my opinion, to a really cohesive narrative across you all. We had Ben with the aesthetics and the communication, Helen with far-right fictions, which obviously has a communicative element, and of course your work with social media comms. So I'm going to be a bit cheeky and use moderator's privilege to ask the question that I'm really interested in, and that is a question for Ben. So Ben, you were getting to the point where you were about to talk about the impacts of some of the changes you've seen with siege culture in the United Kingdom. So I want you, I would appreciate if you could expand more on that, and particularly, and I think I'm interested in this because of the themes of the panel, but particularly with reference to what you were saying about their evolving aesthetics and communication.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point. I think, one of the things I think Helen was kind of was touching on this as well to some extent, and Jade and Julian maybe as well. I think there's a tendency to kind of focus on things that are very tangible, that are very easy to access and are quite easy to research. And when you get to content which is slightly harder to incorporate into kind of research paradigms, so maybe it's that kind of slight fuzziness around emojis and kind of reactions and so on, or maybe it's the fact that fiction is really long and really hard to analyze, and you need to put in the time and the effort and the energy to go through sometimes really badly written books. I think there's a tendency for us to kind of put that by the wayside and focus on what we think is what matters, particularly kind of throwing the idea of radicalization as being kind of the central concern of the discipline as well. I think that kind of further forces people to kind of really start trying to boil it down to kind of proximal and distal factors. And I think one of the things that we've maybe lost sight of in all of this is the fact that a large part of the appeal is kind of taste-based, and it is kind of subcultural. I think Danielle Pursuit has got this phrase, she's in one of her papers, taste and agency. People are making decisions about which subcultures they want to get involved in, how they want to engage, how it makes them feel. So that level of effect, that level of kind of gut reaction and so on is important. And I think what's been interesting about the siege culture scene and the way it's evolved is, it's really tapped into quite an aggressive iteration of that, and it appeals in a way that nothing else really does. It's very distinct from the alt-right. It's very distinct from kind of legacy neo-Nazi or nationalist groups that you might find, or kind of the cultural national things. It really sets itself apart. It's constantly evolving, and I think kind of from a policy and a practitioner perspective, it's really difficult to keep on top of. It requires having people out there kind of really in the weeds, engaging with really kind of ephemeral stuff some of the time.
So one of you showed us an image, and I think the slogan, it was the "Fill Your Hearts with Hate" image, and it had nooses on it. So to my interpretation, that's obviously reflective of the Day of the Rope, which is figured in the Turner Diaries. What do you think the key appeal there is for in a UK context?
Oh God. Right. So someone mentioned Paul Jackson, who runs the Searchlight Archive at Northampton here in the UK, which is a great place if you ever get a chance to go. It's absolutely fascinating. And I did spend some time in there kind of looking through some 1960s, 70s journals for the World Union of National Socialists. And that was kind of edited by Pierce, and kind of there was a letters exchange page. And this is going somewhere, I promise. There's a letters exchange page. And in that, one of the letters was kind of Pierce had sent out this journal to kind of the great and the good. And there was a university professor who wrote back saying, this could have been something really interesting, but you sent me this crappy fascist journal. Why have you done this? And obviously Pierce kind of published this letter, but he was a bit annoyed. Quite interestingly, that the Day of the Rope trope, which comes out of the Turner Diaries to some extent, maybe also the Fall of Berlin, but they hang a university professor from a rope, and it's that kind of trope writ large, which is it's revenge for everything that you've done to us, whoever the enemy might be. It doesn't have to be university professors, but so there's an element of score settling, there's an element of getting revenge. I mean, in terms of that image specifically, and the image of the noose, noose it's also a reference to a specific kind of, it was like a fanzine that was around kind of early on. It's really difficult to get now, but so it might be a more specific reference to that. But no, they generally, the extreme right, they like hangings. I suppose the other thing is it reaches back to kind of lynching and kind of sort of Nazi Germany as well. Yeah,
that's really interesting, Ben. Thank you. Helen, that's probably something that you've also touched upon in your work as well, I would imagine. But we have a very specific question for you, which I'm going to read to make sure I don't get it wrong, which is regarding the debates around terrorist recruitment strategies in terms of privileging the role of social influence on the one hand and mobilization to action on the other. Where do you see these far-right fictions falling across this alleged divide, or do they straddle both in their capacity to both inspire and mobilize action?
I think they really straddle both. The way that these, certainly they tend to narrativize both. So you reasonably often, and I mean, I'm talking about books here like, say, those by Covington and Pierce that are, where we know they're fascists, they're neo-Nazis, that's what they're writing, and it's got a purpose. You get sort of stories of radicalization, so you'll follow characters through their process. Obviously, they don't call it radicalization, but that's what it is. So you'll get them moving from, really often moving from social alienation into, sort of fringes of terror groups, and then into violent action. That's something that happens over and over, say, in Covington's novels. And you'll get characters that move from feeling terrible about themselves to feeling really good about themselves, sort of across that process. So it's sort of, really straddling the divide by modeling a process of, I guess, ideological shift, which is always followed up by violent action.
So to sort of bounce a bit then off some of the stuff Ben spoke about, do you think, do you want to expand there on the appeal that holds with, sympathetic far-right fringe cultures?
Do you mean a fiction?
Like when they read it, is it, is there some self-ideation happening there, or?
Look, I don't think the research that we're doing isn't looking at isn't kind of engaged with reader responses. We're not talking with people who read these things and what they do with them, or so how they respond. I think it's it's pretty clear that nobody becomes radicalized and violent just from reading a novel. I think that's fairly uncontroversial to say, but when they're part of a kind of broader ecosystem, and if what you're engaging with is constantly these stories of a world that functions in the way that you think it does, a world that aligns with your ideology, with characters where you're building empathy and sort of associating your own moral judgments with theirs, with their ethical positions. It's kind of always repeated modeling of the same kinds of positions.
Yeah. Okay. That's really.
And so it reaches people who, you can reach people with a story like that, that you can't with a kind of navel-gazing political tract.
Yeah, and it struck me that it's actually quite a really interesting way to, and I'm applying agency here that may not exist, but it seems to me a very cunning way to avoid objectionable material takedowns as well, if you're framing something as a work of fiction and a creative work.
Absolutely. And, Covington was talking about that in the early 2000s. Wow. And saying, I probably would have been hauled off to jail if I'd said this just on a blog. But because it's fiction, nobody's paying any attention, and nobody cares if they are reading it. But there's certainly that element around it. Yeah,
it's quite depressing and grim. Our next question, I think, applies to all of your presentations. So Jade or Julian or whoever, feel free to jump in first. But the question is, how do we counter subcultures locally when so many provisions focus on formal organizations, which are less and less relevant in many countries? That might have been one for you, Ben, actually.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's something that's constantly on my mind. So, I mean, the issue that we've had in the UK is certainly prescription of organisations. I understand this is probably a bit more of a live debate in Australia at the moment. The prescription of organisations is kind of the primary mechanism by which far-right extremists have gone to prison in the UK, or the bulk of them. There are other things in there as well, linked to specific behaviours, but And I think it's quite natural that kind of like I said, they are relearning that lesson, and they are kind of moving to a post-organizational future in which, they're not going to join branded organizations because they are vulnerable. So it's almost like every generation has to relearn that lesson. I think the issue for enforcement is that pushes you into territory which it's slightly less easy, right? Because you need to focus on specific behaviors, whether that's plotting behaviors, whether that's hate speech, whether that's specific threats, whatever it might be. But then you need to accept that there's a large part that you can't touch because, like Helen said, there are all kinds of obfuscations that people can use. We can present it as fiction. There's lots of hypothetical questions. There's all these kinds of ways of talking about violence in that kind of stochastic terrorism model, right? Which is that you constantly raise these questions and you let your audience fill in the blanks. I think there's an element that commercial pressure and kind of social pressure would prevent this material from finding an easy home. So that is kind of one way of kind of limiting the spread. This stuff is getting harder to access. The most extreme stuff is harder to find on open social networks. But it's also starting to, if you take a more kind of enforcement approach, a more legal approach, it starts putting you into very uncomfortable territory around which books are legal and which books are illegal, or when is it okay to kind of engage in hypotheticals and those kind of things. And those are questions which I think particularly sort of liberal democracies have a very, very difficult time in answering, and it doesn't seem like something we've made too much progress on. But yeah, it is a live issue. It throws the focus much more on kind of specific behaviors and kind of opens up that kind of civil enforcement question as well.
Yeah. Julian, you looked like you had something to add to that.
Not so much, Christy. I was just thinking and nodding away as Ben was speaking because it's such a difficult question. I guess I'd just add a point. Since you asked around, what we mean by counter in that case, what are we trying to counter? Are we trying to counter terrorist acts, potential live shooting attacks, or are we trying to counter a creeping threat to liberal democracy from the inside as societal discourse radicalizes, and becomes more aligned, say, with far-right tropes, anti-democratic tropes? Different threats have different, need for different sort of responses. If you're trying to prevent a shooting attack, such as we saw in Christchurch, then you probably need terrorism provisions to do that, counterterrorism laws potentially, to be able to disrupt and so on earlier. It makes it very difficult if someone's not part of a group, as just been explained. But I would just argue and point out, I guess, that the bigger issue maybe with the extreme right in Australia is not so much your active shooters. It's a huge issue, that of course, but it's not so much the pointy terrorist end. It's more that online milieu, that social milieu of sort of moving discourse and discussion towards the conspiratorial and the anti-democratic and the racist and the hateful and so on. And that's more the CVE approach, of course.
Yes, of course. Yeah, absolutely. So when we're talking about different ways of talking about violence, I think what that's raised for me is a question for you, Jade. In your stats, in the Australian data set, there was a 5% there was a 5% assignation of wow. Now, that's probably my favorite reaction on Facebook. So I was wondering, in terms of how you and your team were interpreting some of the narratives that you were encountering and some of the support that you were seeing for various narratives. How did you sort of conceptualize wow?
Yeah, this is a difficult question, and I did my best to hedge, our understanding of any of these emoji-based options on posts, by saying that it really does depend on the online context and the cultural product to which it's assigned and the user's reading of it. I mean, reactions like anger and love, became the focus of this research project because it signified to us not only that it was quite popular within these groups and wider communities, but that the narratives to which they were most commonly assigned, were, sort of the foundation of, of understanding of extremism being in-group, out-group dynamics. And we did peer into some of the narratives to which haha was paired with most commonly. But, reactions like haha and wow and thankful, which weirdly every now and then, has an enormous spike of activity, seem to be more ambiguous. The pairings seem to be more scattered, and so for both economical reasons and for reasons of concern, we decided to focus on haha and love. Julian, unless you have something to add.
So they became almost your key navigation points as you were going into the data set.
Yeah, they were sort of the main avenues as well, in which we that guided or piloted the in-depth qualitative analysis. But of course, there's always more room to see what wow might mean.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for that. We've run out of time. I feel obligated to pass on some compliments we've got from the Q&A bar, where people said this has been a great session, and I absolutely agree. It's been really fascinating seeing all these different angles, looking at the different contexts of right-wing extremism, and also looking at those different methods of expression and communication, and thinking about what the potential implications of those may be. So thank you all for your presentations. They were fantastic. I think we're going to take a break now, and we will reconvene at 1800. Thank you.